Identity there. Istanbul itself, you cross the bridge, you cross from Asia to Europe. Turkey also presented itself as a model of Islam and democracy. And perhaps not many people remember when Erdogan came to Egypt during the Muslim Brotherhood period, he said the state has to be second. Very few were surprised about that statement, and I think members of the Muslim Brotherhood reacted very strongly. But also there are lots of talks about Turkey becoming authoritarian. So you have this diversity of a country that is very intriguing, very interesting case. But what makes this talk much more revealing is the speaker himself. He was an ambassador to Turkey, stayed for 2.5 years, but not like any civil servant. Dr. Alaa is AUC, and he has a PhD. So he actually is a bridge between policy analysis and academic approach. And this is what you would see that in his talk. In fact, when he was in the foreign ministry, he was also the head of the diplomatic institute, in addition to being the spokesperson for the Egyptian government. So he has these two sides in him, and very rarely, really, we have the bridge between policy analysis and a sort of academic scientific journey. So I expect an exceptional talk. And with that, I give the floor to Dr. Ahmed.
Well, first of all, let me thank Professor Korany for allowing me to come and give this talk about Turkey. I hope your expectations are not high as Dr. Korany, because whatever I say, some of it can be found in the 4 questions raised in the poster. Let me go back to 1985, which was my first extensive visit to Turkey. At that time, I don't know how many of you knew, whether even Dr. Korany, my father was also the ambassador in Turkey. So according to some people, I was the person who put the president of the Tawris. I don't know how to say it in English. Inheritance. Anyway. In 1985, it's a very interesting year personally, because that was the year I got my PhD from, and I just come from London. My father was there for about almost a year, and the whole family joined my father, and he took his annual vacation, and we made like a tour in Turkey. We went to Istanbul, Izmir, Cappadocia. For about maybe 2 or 3 weeks, we were touring all over Turkey. And the thing which caught my attention at that time, and 85 at that time, the president was Kenan Evren, who took over after the military coup of 1980. The kind of division between urban and rural Turkey. This is the first thing which struck me in this tour in Turkey. You go to Izmir, you go to Istanbul, you come from Ankara, certain places, certain areas, and then passing through the countryside, you feel you are living in two different countries. The rural Turkey with the people wearing the hijab, women wearing the scarf, the mosques everywhere, and then you go to the urban centers, whether in Istanbul or in Izmir, no mosques, no hijab. The people are very, very Europeanized. You feel you are in part of Europe. It has nothing to do with the countryside you just passed through, let's say, a few days ago. So this is the first thing I want to bear in mind, the division, this sharp division between urban and rural Turkey. And that was in 1985, which is not a long time ago. This leads me to my second observation when I came back 20 years later as an ambassador. Of course, I had the memories of my trip 20 years earlier, and have made several visits to Turkey, whether during my father's tenure or later in official capacities in very short visits. But in 2007, when I went there as an ambassador, and it was very interesting because it was just a few months after Abdullah Gül became the president, and there was at that time politically a kind of conflict between the so-called Islamists and the so-called secularists. And I'm going to explain why I'm saying the so-called. Anyway, without going into deep details about the conflict at that time and a lot of politics, but let me go back to my first observation. The division between the rural and urban, and I'll give you two examples to explain to you the other division, which is between the secularists, or who call themselves the secularists, and the Islamists, or who call themselves Islamists. After my arrival, by 2 or 3 months, it was Ramadan. And there was an invitation to the embassy to attend an event by one of the leading Turkish multinational companies, the Sabancı. For those of you who know Turkey, when you say Sabancı, you're speaking about a very, very, very big company, international company. The family of Sabancı has its own museum. It's an empire. And I couldn't go to that function for one reason or the other, and I sent my deputy, who was a female diplomat, but an Egyptian like any other Egyptian. And the second day I asked her how was the reception, and she told me, Ambassador, they were serving alcohol. They were serving whiskey. It's Ramadan. And I was fasting. And I was with the Indonesian ambassador. We couldn't just break our fast on whiskey. This explains to you the kind of isolation or the kind of division between the secular elite, the big multinational business, and the rest of the population. A few months after that, I had a delegation from the Egyptian Ministry of Interior. They were all officers, about 20 of them, coming for a course hosted by the Police Academy in Ankara. And like any Egyptians also coming, Friday came, and although they were all police officers, but they wanted to go and pray in a mosque, and that was a problem. And I had to interfere as the Egyptian ambassador to talk to the authorities, to talk to the director of the police academy and tell him, look, they have to go and pray in the mosque, otherwise it's going to be a problem. Because in Turkey, if you are a police officer, if you are a member of the state, if you belong to the ruling elite, And you have to abide by the Ataturk doctrine, which was in name very secular, but in essence very anti-religion. Not only Islam, any kind of religion. And if you are caught not only praying, but if you are caught only reading the Quran, you are dismissed. So this explains to you the kind of cleavage, the kind of division between the urban and then secularist elite and now I'm even more nervous. Professor Saadettin Ibrahim was my professor how many years ago, and whatever I became, it's because of him and his education to me. You know. So we are not just speaking about an urban-rural division, which any student of political science in my generation, the first thing he learns about the Middle East, and especially about Egypt and Turkey, is that there is an urban, secular European elite and a rural, traditional Muslim masses, which in Turkey is very, very manifest, but also in Turkey it takes in Turkey it goes far even worse than in Egypt, in no way to compare to Egypt, because in Egypt you cannot imagine a police officer who is so secular that he cannot go and pray, or that he will be punished because he is praying. Even in Egypt during the period of liberal Western dominance, religion was never in doubt. Practicing Islam was never in doubt. In Turkey, it is a problem. In Turkey, it is an issue. And this explains the power base of Erdogan. This explains just being a practicing Muslim. He appeals to a vast majority of the population, or at least a large, very large constituency, which was not only ignored during a very long period, but what was also forbidden from entering the army, forbidden from entering the police, forbidden from entering the university. If you are wearing a hijab, for example, you couldn't enter university. So this is a kind of division which I can speak about, and how it manifests itself in daily life for hours and hours. And I can give many other examples. I just gave you two: the serving of alcohol in Ramadan and the police officers who were not even allowed to recite the Quran, let alone pray or do things like that. But this leads me to my third observation about Turkey, is that speaking about this urban-rural division, speaking about this secular Islamist division, it doesn't mean that Turkish society is a homogeneous society only divided by the urban and the rural, or by the secular elite and the non-secular elite. Inside this Muslim community of Turkey, there is also other divisions which we never speak about here, at least in Egypt. And I'm speaking about the division between the Sunni and the Alawites. And the impression we have here in Egypt, or the idea, is that in Turkey it's a Sunni country, it's a Muslim Sunni country. Okay, you have the secular elite, but it's a Sunni country. Actually, the Alawites are considered a sizable minority. Officially, they are 17%. Unofficially, they are more than that. And if you are an Alawite, by the way, they are different from the Alawites of Syria, but it explains the kind of relationship at one time they had with Syria. But the Alawites in Turkey are a considerable group. They have their own weight. And if you are a Alawite, you are more prone to become secular. You are more prone to become leftist. You are more prone to become European. So actually, the secular elite is mostly coming from not the Sunni majority, but coming from the Alawites. So we have this kind of division between the Alawites and the Sunni inside the Muslim community, which I'll go back and come to it later and explain a couple of things. But going even deeper than that, we go to a fourth division inside Turkey, which is an ethnic division, which is between the Turks and the Kurds. And this is another division which everybody now is speaking about, but actually inside the Kurdish community, and by the way, I said the Alawites were 17%. No, the Alawites are much more than that. I don't know how many, but they're much more, maybe 1/3 of the population. But the Kurds, who are officially 17% and even much more, inside themselves, they are divided between Sunni Kurds and Alawite Kurds. And if you are a Kurd and you are a Sunni, then you are most probably a supporter of Erdogan. And Erdogan was intelligent enough to try to reach out to the Sunni Kurds under the umbrella of a new identity, the Islamic identity. He didn't call it Islamic, but it says Islamic roots. And in that way, the Sunni Kurds, who were conservative by nature, felt that they can support Erdogan as Muslims without losing their identity as Kurds. But if you are a Kurdish Alawite, and half of the Kurds are almost half of the Kurds are Alawites, then you are prone to become more a leftist, a secularist, i.e. a supporter of the PKK. So there is also that division inside the Kurdish community, which enters into the politics and enters into the calculations of any elections. This being said, you have a religious division, you have an ethnic division, you have a communal division, you have also a geographical division between coastal Turkey and the hinterland, between what they call the coast, which is mostly Istanbul, Izmir, and all the cities on the Mediterranean, and the hinterland, which is the Anatolia plateau. And most of the urban, secular, non-Sunni community are on the coast, and the conservative Sunni Turkish group or community are in the hinterland. And they are considered the power base of the AKP. So if you are coming from Izmir, if you are a Kurdish, and if you are Alawite, or if you are even a Sunni but liberal, then most probably you will not be an AKP. The final, of course, division, which everybody knows, is the military-civilian division. And as I said, because of Ataturk and because of the heritage of the Ataturk legacy, and without going into a lot of history and a lot of details, the military is considered the custodian of the secular principles, the embodiment of secularism in Turkey. So if you are in the military, no way your wife can be wearing a hijab. No way you can be a practicing Muslim. No way you can be a religious person or oriented towards the East, for example. And of course, on the face of it, you can easily put these 6 divisions. And on one side, you have urban, secular, Sunni, Turkish, coast, from the coast, and military. They all share the same group, as you can say. And on the other side, you have rural, Islamist, Alawite, Kurdish, coming from Anatolia, and civilian. So it's not just enough to be, for example, a Turk or a Sunni in order to understand a lot of the politics. Because the image we have, and we deal with Turkey as mostly Turkish, mostly Sunni, when it breaks down to numbers, actually, who is considered a Turkish Sunni, i.e. the core of Turkish identity, will be about 50%, 55%. 45%, plus or minus, are other groups. So Erdogan, as long as there is this kind of division in Turkey, as long as there is this kind of cleavage, and especially between the secular and the non-secular, rest assured he will win every election. Because the secularists, or the adherents, or the followers, or the people who consider themselves carrying the torch of Ataturk, they were politically so narrow-minded in not adhering or not even paying lip service to the Islamic identity of the country, that it was enough to just say that, look, he's not a practicing Muslim, or that he is against the hijab, to fail in the elections. And in the last presidential elections, Muharrem Enji, who was the leader of the opposition, coming from the CHP, which is Ataturk's party, it was well known that he was a non-practicing Muslim. And he tried during the elections to win over the traditional base. So he made statements like, I'm not against the hijab. And in one occasion, they took him to a mosque in Istanbul to pray, and they photographed it to prove that he is a practicing Muslim. Of course, it was so phony, so artificial, that it backfired. In the last elections, in the municipal elections, Imam Oglu, who, okay, it's still disputed, who won the elections in Istanbul, although he is a CHP, although he represents the opposition to Erdogan, and although he is anti-AKP, and he's a confessed secularist, yet, and here I underline it, yet, he comes from a very traditional family. He's a practicing Muslim. There is no doubt about his credentials as a traditional Turk who goes to pray 5 times a day. Everybody knows that. Everybody has been seeing that for the past 20 years of his life. He does not have to prove that he is a practicing Muslim, unlike Muharrem Enji. And that's why he won. And that's why many people felt comfortable in voting for him. And that is the crux of the problem. That is the real battle. Who will win the hearts and minds of the people? As long as the opposition, the secular opposition, portrays itself as indifferent to Islamic values, as indifferent to the hijab, as indifferent to the practicing masses, they will remain confined to the coast, they will remain confined to urban centers, they will remain confined to some Alawites and anybody who has a grudge against the ruling party. Now, I spoke about these divisions. I spoke about the 6 divisions of Turkey, or the Turkish people, and that it's a myth speaking about a majority of Turkish Muslims. But what unites all of them, and this is my real experience, what unites all of them, whether you are secularists or a traditional Muslim practitioner, whether you are an Alawite or a Kurd or an ethnic Muslim coming from Anatolia. What unites them all, and that was a surprise to me, was the trauma of World War I. They live the defeat of World War I today. It happened, about a century ago? We celebrated 100 years. And yet, when I was there from 2007 to 2010, people were, the elite, you speak to a man in the streets, all the journalists, academics, diplomats I met, business people, you feel it. They have been defeated yesterday. There's still the agony, the trauma, the psychological impact of the defeat. That they were once an empire and they lost, even the secularists. They were once a great power and they have been humbled. And there is this urge and need to prove to themselves that despite the fact that they were defeated, yet they are on equal basis or on par with those who defeated them. Thus, there is this urge and need to be recognized as Europeans, to enter the European Union, even among the Islamists, who are supposed to be anti-Western. And this is the only thing which unites the various divisions in Turkey. If there is unanimity in Turkey between a secularist and an Islamist, is this need for recognition that they are Europeans. I remember once, and I don't want to do like old ambassadors on retirement, keep on speaking about the memories, but allow me this once. I was invited by a group of Western diplomats for a luncheon. It was the Australian ambassador, Randa, my wife will remember him, with Ahmed Dawood Oghlu. At that time, Ahmed Dawood Oghlu was just the advisor of Erdogan for foreign affairs, but already he was known. It was Ahmed Dawood Oghlu. And to the surprise of Ahmed Dawood Oghlu, I was there, and I was the only non-Western, non-European. And because of protocol, I sat on the left of Ahmed Dawood Oghlu, and the ambassador of Australia was on the right, and then the rest. We were about 15 ambassadors, all Western from European countries. And of course, he was coming with a certain agenda in his mind, speaking to the European ambassadors and proving the point that he was, Turkey is European. But I was there. So, he got a little bit confused. So all the time he was making a point and then ending up, and this proves that we are Europeans. And then turning left to me, and also Muslims. Europeans and also Muslims. And actually, he was genuine. He was genuine. They really believed, or they wanted to believe, and they needed to believe, that they are on equal basis with Europe. And that's why Europe had to accept them in the EU, And this will be their absolution from the defeat of World War I after 80, 90 years. So this need to go to the European Union, in my humble opinion, is not just political, it's also psychological, it's historical, it's redressing the defeat of World War I. So whether you are on the left, on right, secularist, traditionalist, you want to join the European Union, each for a different reason. The intelligence of Erdogan and Ahmed Dawood is that how they capitalized and invested the relationship with the European Union, in which even the army couldn't say or couldn't object to it, because the army was a secularist, and if you are a secularist, you are a European, and if you are a European, then you must be a member of the European Union, though the fact that, of course, being a member of the European Union, you had to curtail the role of the army, but of course the army didn't, ignore this part. And it was Erdogan who raised the mantle of European Union more than even his most secularist predecessors in order to achieve a double objective. To curtail the role of the army, and he outsmarted them in that. And the other thing, of course, is to use the European Union to modernize Turkey. And in modernizing Turkey, he was very successful. In the first 10 years of Erdogan's rule, the per capita income increased 3 times, which is quite an achievement. And also, he used the European Union to not only economically achieve whatever he achieved, and Turkey becoming the 17th largest economy in the world, but also in mobilizing the business community, in gaining the support of the business community, and also in not only curtailing the power of the army, as I said, but the bureaucracy, the judiciary, the education, every aspect in life in Turkey was according to EU standards. In education, I've seen that. Even in the bureaucracy, I've seen that. So, and in that, he was really genuine. He was very intelligent. He used it to his advantage. So everything was going right. And then, naturally, reforms took its course. And one of the pillars of his reform was to extend a hand to the Kurds, to attempt reconciliation with the Turks, but there was a certain limit to where he can go. How far can he go in his reconciliation with the Turks, with the Kurds, sorry. Erdogan based his power, or based his success, one can say, on 4 principles. Very quickly, the EU, as I mentioned, cultivating a relationship and using the EU. Economic reforms, as I mentioned quickly. Cultural identity, this is the most important thing, that being just in power, it was like Obama being elected in the United States and all the blacks felt they are finally in power. So just being elected, and he's a practicing Muslim, and his wife is wearing a hijab for the masses, that was more than enough. They didn't want more. It was recognition of their existence. They were ignored before. And he was intelligent enough not to describe himself as an Islamist, but as a social conservative. I remember speaking to one of the pillars of the AKP party, and you were speaking and he said, he's not one of us, speak about one of them. So I asked him, what do you mean by not one of us? One of us, the Islamists? He said, no. You're so frightened. No, 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 we are not Islamists. Even though I'm the ambassador of Egypt, I'm not the European ambassador. I'm not European. We are social conservatives. And that's how he presented himself. In order also to woo whoever was with the secularists. They're very, very keen on portraying themselves that they're open-minded. Especially that he depended on another ally who he fell off with later, which is Fathallah Gulen. And this is, I'll leave it to another discussion. So it was not just the kind of Muslim Brotherhood Islamic movement. Fathallah Gulen and his group needs another discussion in order to understand and their role. And actually they were the real power base of Erdogan. I've taken much of the time. Anyway, so with Fathallah Gulen, the kind of ideological support and social support and actually logistical support given to Erdogan, he tried to crown his achievements with reaching a historical agreement with the Kurds, but there were certain red lines the army, the secularists, the nationalists couldn't accept, and Erdogan had to run his course. And Erdogan made the calculation that, okay, I've reached my limit with the Kurds. I've reached my limit also with all the economic reforms, and there's some articles about that, to what extent he could have continued his economic miracle. I reached my limit in proving that I am the representative of the masses, traditional masses, the peasants, the rural population. And with the attempted coup of July 2016, the calculations were quite visible to me that he had to substitute Fathallah Gulen with Dawlat Bahshatli. Dawlat Bahshatli is the leader of the nationalists, the hardcore chauvinist Turks, who are by definition Turkish, not Kurds, by definition Sunni, not Alawites, by definition mostly coming from urban centers, also or some very, very traditional rural areas, but they are the nationalists. And they constitute between 11 and 12 and 13% of the electoral vote. And for Erdogan, now, this is the ruling coalition. Okay, they are the junior partners, but he is dependent on them, on these nationalists, and thus any hint or any inclination towards further steps with the Kurds is gone. Forget about any reconciliation with the Kurds. Forget about any opening, any liberal or modernization on EU basis inside Turkey. He no longer is betting, and he no longer needs the support of the EU as he used to until 5 years ago. It explains a lot of his foreign policy steps, which I ignored it for the purpose of time. And now, for Erdogan, the Kurds, whom he spent the first 10 years of his tenure trying to reconcile with them, are now enemy number one. And that's why you can understand all what's happening in Syria. Look always at the Kurdish angle. And now Erdogan is, I wouldn't say running his course, he's extremely intelligent and can give many examples. His economic reforms have reached their cycle. And of course he tried to do things which we can speak about in the discussion. Economically, Erdogan now is facing a big problem. Yet, as long as the secular opposition fails to address the traditional masses and prove to them that they are part of them, not an alien outside elite ruling from their villas in Istanbul or Izmir, Erdogan will remain in power. And maybe there is a ray of hope with the new leader of the opposition, Imamoglu, but it's still too early to say what will happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Lots of practitioners have anecdotes, but linking them scientifically to the situation is rare. And this is through his articles in Shuruk. Many of you read these articles. This is what Ambassador ElHadidi was trying to do in giving us an anatomy of Turkish society, linking the present to history, Ottoman Empire, the trauma, lots of things. I was hesitant to stop him talking, exceeding the time, because I wanted to give enough time to questions. But what he was saying as an observer was so interesting, it was really hard to stop him. With this then, I'll just, will not, there are so many issues we didn't touch even on foreign policy. I mean, Turkey is in a NATO member, now trying to acquire some of the most sophisticated missiles from Russia. Here is another dimension. I just received a paper from a Turkish scholar identifying 22 foreign policy roles for Turkey. Lots of things. It is a rich country. But rather than continuing from the top, I think I leave the issue to the floor and have your questions.
This new coalition with an ultra-nationalist party explains a lot, and certainly it explains the situation vis-a-vis the Kurds, as you've noted. But it still doesn't help me understand why thousands of university professors, of school teachers, of ordinary people are being jailed, who aren't even particularly political, just aren't Islamist or aren't on the right. And I think there must still be a missing piece. What is he so afraid of?
We'll take a few questions and then I'll give the floor to...
Thank you, Alaa. Alaa and me go a long way back since he was a student, and we went to China together. We did a lot of things together. And I'm very pleased to see you after all these years, still as crisp and sharp, and touching a subject that has been of a concern to me and to most Egyptian and Arab scholars about Turkey and about Erdogan. I was one of those 10, 15 years ago that I wrote believing that finally there is a Turk who is both Islamist and modernist and Democrat, a Muslim democracy at its best. That was, I believe, 15 years ago. However, so many waters have gone under the bridges of both Turkey and the Middle East that the so-called attempted coup, which in my humble heart felt that it was a pretext whether it really happened the way he said it did, but it seemed to have been a pretext to get rid of all his opposition, of all kinds. And that, I feel, not information, but your instincts as a man who lived and studied Turkey. This is one. The other point that I'd like you to also bring up to date is the so-called green capitalism of Anatolia, which seemed to have been his power base in ascendance, going up. Now, is that base still intact, or has it eroded over time? And finally, and this goes beyond your presentation and closer to what Dr. Bahgat was hinting at, that's foreign policy. Erdogan is now viewed in Egypt, both officially and by the media, as Mr. Evil, almost enemy number one to the Egyptian state, to the Egyptian people. And is that a deserved description? Is he really an enemy of Egypt? They viewed him as if nothing. He gets up every morning, what I'm going to do to Egypt today. I feel that this is an exaggeration, but is there any element of truth that the guy has a grudge, especially against Egypt and its leadership? And is that grudge because of what happened to the Muslim brothers? This is some questions that need to be at least hinted at or addressed or opened for speculation. Thank you.
Another question, perhaps a student would like to give us a question? Very good.
Thank you for the talk, but I want to ask about the idea of Neo-Ottoman itself, why it became in the ground, why scholars and doctors are viewing that Turkey now is Neo-Ottoman, not a European, as you mentioned, and why the European newspaper are stating that Erdogan now are the Sultan, not a president. That's it. Thank you.
There will be enough time to have another round of questions.
Well, first of all, let me answer two questions with one answer. The question from Barbara about the imprisonment of thousands and thousands of academics, actually opposition in general, and my professor from Saadin Ibrahim about it, Turk, Muslim, reformist, Democrat, all that stuff. I go back to what I referred in passing to Fethullah Gulen. How to describe Fethullah Gulen? Fethullah Gulen is, at least from my point of view or from my angle, could be described as the reformist, liberal Islamist who believed in openness. He's considered like a liberal Islamist. And as long as Fethullah Gulen and Erdogan were in alliance, you can see Turkey going to a certain direction. Not only for practical reasons, and also I will do like all ambassadors. In Ramadan, for example, there was an iftar hosted by Erdogan for the foreign ambassadors when I was there, and he brought a singing group, a chanting group from Antakya, who were composed of Muslims, Christians, and Jews. And they start singing, started with Andalusian chants, then going to some Christian Orthodox chants, and ending up with Jewish, what you call them. Can you imagine a Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, for example, doing that? And of course, immediately I recognized that his message was mostly to the European Union to tell them, look, we are open, we are, there's no need to be afraid of us, we are not the Islamists whom the secularists portrayed them to be. But it was more deeper than that. It was the influence of, it goes into the basic principles of Fethullah Gulen. Once the alliance with Fethullah Gulen was dismantled for whatever reason, there are official reasons. There is the story that, the narrative of Erdogan that he was conspiring against him and that he was behind the coup of July 2016. Erdogan, I would say, was in a state of paranoia, and all the ideological and other restraints were removed, and he let himself fall victim to his own personal instincts, and especially in power grabbing. I linked that to another phenomena I didn't touch about because I don't want to inform policy. This is another issue, but let me also relate to a certain incident. If you remember in Davos, 2009, after the offensive, the Israeli offensive in Gaza, and the famous Davos incident in which Erdogan left the podium, the stage, because the panel refused to give him extra time to answer or rebuke Peres, Shimon Peres. And this is the story we know here. The story which we do not know here, or maybe some of you know it, is that when he returned back to Istanbul, he was received by thousands and thousands of people in the airport, and he was greeted as El-Fatih. El-Fatih is the title given to Muhammad Sultan al-Fatih, and he was greeted as somebody who, as we say in Arabic, Fatah. And to make things even more personal for me, I had a lot of journalists we were on very friendly basis, and they will come and tell me after this incident, who is more popular, do you think, Abdel Nasser or Erdogan? They were stoking, and I think he believed that he became the leader not only of Turkey, but not only of the Arab world, but of the whole Middle East, of the whole Islamic world. And if you are the leader of the Muslim world and you start comparing yourself after going out of a meeting to Nasser in 1956, it gives you the kind of mentality and kind of paranoia and kind of ego you are dealing with. So I'm not surprised with that happened later. I mean, these two factors. There are, of course, other factors, but just for the sake of the time, I'll confine myself to this answer. Speak about the green money. The backbone of the AKP party are the small and medium businessmen of what they call the tigers of Anatolia. Not the Sabanji, not the Kosh, not the big business or the secular business of the coast, the secularists whom I described earlier. But Erdogan was intelligent enough to achieve a kind of balance between these two groups. He maintained the relationship with the Sabanjis and the Kosh and all other groups, but at the same time he was cultivating these medium and small, And he did that by opening to them the markets of the Middle East. The free trade agreement he did with Egypt, he did with several other countries, everybody benefited from it. And Tuzman, who was the Minister of Foreign Trade, who was the kind of engineer of this open door policy in the sense that opening to other countries, not like in the Egyptian sense, actually was not an AKP party member. And when I refer to somebody telling me he's not one of us, he was actually speaking about Tuzman. But Erdogan was intelligent enough to use non-AKP members or non-hardcore AKP members, use their talent and open and achieve that. Now he's not doing that. And now his economic policies are failing because of political reasons and also economic reasons. The political reasons, of course, is his tension with the United States and the kind of trade war he's entering with the United States, Trump punishing Turkey for its political stance, and this is a whole new issue, a whole different issue. And also because, as some people are arguing, that his economic reforms have run their course. He can no longer. To what extent is this power base still faithful to Erdogan? It is, because the other side is not intelligent enough in order to woo them and take them into their arms. They are still prisoners of the Ataturk traditions of the years until very recently. So it's more political. The final question was why Neo-Ottoman? Because Erdogan started at the beginning with Ahmed Davutoğlu, another person, opening to the EU, and EU was his priority. But when he felt that he no longer will benefit from the EU, that he has reached the limit of how beneficial he can get from the EU, even in using them to curtail the army, even in using them to modernize Turkey, because he already achieved that, he started speaking openly about Turkey leading the Muslim world. And that is why he has fallen out with Saudi Arabia, not just because of Khashoggi, because Saudi Arabia regards itself as the leader of the Muslim world, the custodian of the two holy spheres, and now Erdogan saying that I am the leader. And of course, although he never speaks openly or directly about an Ottoman state or reviving the Ottoman state, but everybody understands that this is what is in the background. Okay?
We cannot, because many people are already leaving to go to their classes, but we are having coffee, so there would be a continuation of the discussion, different points, very rich. I just want to confirm what I have said at the beginning of the introduction. We have a masterful case of bridging personal experiences, anecdotes, and rigorous analysis. And I want to thank Ambassador Hadidi for doing this for us. Thank you very much.
I must say one final thing. The first person to give me a chance to sit on a podium and speak to an audience on my very first experience was Professor Saadetdin Ibrahim. And that was after we came back from China, and there was in the Oriental Hall. And I remember that moment until today. So thank you. And
very good. We will continue.